good afternoon, Year 11. Welcome to this pre-recorded version of our Paper 1B revision lesson. Can't quite believe that our first exam is just a couple of days away, but there we are. So hopefully you've all had a chance to have a good look at this resource. I did post it on Teams and Dojo over the weekend. I have included some of the slides I used in the Easter revision session, most notably this slide here, which just gives you a reminder of exactly what has been assessed so far in the 4 different examination seasons. So I've simplified everything down for you in terms of breaking up the Cold War into its 3 different component parts. So there's the origins of the Cold War up to 1949. So make sure you're familiar with all the key chronology there. There's the development of the Cold War up to 1960, which of course includes events in Asia and culminates with the U2 crisis of 1960. Then there's the final part, part 3, which is called the transformation of the Cold War, which starts with the crisis over Berlin and culminates in the period known as détente. So what I'm going to do in this pre-recorded revision lesson is to break it down into 3 chunks. So this first part of the recording, I will talk to you about events up to 1949. And then I'll record a separate video for part 2 and a separate video for part 3. And hopefully that should be a bit quicker to upload as well. So it will be in 3 different parts. So part 1, let's start with the origins of the Cold War. These are all the key events that take place in the wake of World War II, leading to the events of the Berlin blockade and the development of NATO to 1949. So what you must be able to do in looking at the origins of the Cold War is to come to a judgment as to what developments were the most important for the increase in hostilities during this time. Certainly, if it comes up as the 16 marker, that's what you'll have to do. So, as we all know, the Cold War, the lines demarcating East and West all go back to World War II, with the Soviet forces pushing the German army out of the occupied territories of Central and Eastern Europe back to Germany and Berlin, and of course the Western powers after D-Day pushing the German forces out of France and the Low Countries. And effectively where the 2 sides met became over time the dividing line between East and West. It became the Iron Curtain, which went straight through Germany. But of course, as we know, the Russian forces, the Soviet forces, reached Berlin first. So the first major summit between the Grand Alliance, the 3 big leaders, Roosevelt, Churchill and Stalin, took place at Yalta in February of 1945. Yalta, of course, is in Ukraine. So it was deep in Soviet territory. This was obviously several months before the end of the war, although even at this stage it was a question of when and not if the Germans were defeated. But by and large, this was a pretty jovial conference, and it was marked more by cooperation and agreement than by disagreement. Stalin appeared to seed the idea of allowing free elections in the countries liberated by the Soviet Red Army. A United Nations organization was set up, but of course the big agreement was that Germany would be divided into 4 zones of occupation. And equally Berlin would also be divided into 4, even though at that stage it was quite clear that the Soviet Red Army was going to reach Berlin first. The only issue at Yalta, of course, was Poland. Stalin was keen to keep the parts of Poland that he'd won as part of the Nazi-Soviet pact in 1939 when the Germans and the Russians divided Poland up between them. So Stalin was insistent as part of weakening Germany to push the Polish border further west. That was the only real issue at Yalta. Otherwise, the Yalta conference was, as I said earlier, was largely marked or characterized by cooperation rather than by disagreement. Now, of course, by April of 1945, the battle for Berlin had begun, and the Soviet troops under General Zhukov captured Berlin, captured the Reichstag, before obviously the Western forces were able to reach Berlin. So the second major conference, of course, was Potsdam. Potsdam, as you can see on the map, is a suburb of Berlin. But significantly, there's a change of leadership at Potsdam. Churchill was replaced midway through the conference by the Labour leader Clement Attlee, and of course Roosevelt had died and he was replaced by President Truman. But by and large, the agreements over Germany were the same. Germany was going to be divided exactly as had been agreed at Yalta, and Berlin was going to be divided in exactly the same way. It was also agreed that the Allies would receive reparations from Germany, which they would take from their respective zones of occupation. But the big source of tension at Potsdam was between Truman and Stalin. And even at this early stage, Stalin wanted to exact crippling reparations on Germany. He wanted Germany eventually to be united as a single communist state, which would be kept weak and would be kept as a Soviet satellite. And Truman, even this early on, began to fundamentally disagree with that. So the big area of dispute at Potsdam was really on the future of Germany and how severely Germany should be punished. Another source of tension, of course, was the bomb. Truman had already received news that the first atomic bomb had been successfully tested in the deserts of Los Alamos in New Mexico. He kept it close to his chest. He kept making sort of allusions to this ultimate new weapon. Stalin knew all about the bomb, of course, because the Manhattan Project had been long infiltrated by Soviet spies. So again, that was a source of tension. Now, events really, but the relations between the superpowers really begin to break down in 1946, so a year after the war came to an end. George Kennan, if you remember, was an American diplomat who had been working out in Moscow for many years. He made a very lengthy statement via telegram, which became known as a long telegram, in which he effectively encouraged the Truman administration to look at the Soviet Union with suspicion. He described the Soviet Union as a police state. He described it as having the same type of imperialist ambitions as the old Tsarist empire, and he claimed that the Soviet Union would try to sow divisions between the Western powers. So the big takeout of that was, we cannot work with the Soviets. They can't be trusted. And this was, again, quite crucial in influencing President Truman's thinking. Several weeks later, Churchill, no longer Prime Minister, of course, but still very respected in America, on a visit to the United States in Missouri, delivered his now famous Iron Curtain speech. He went on to say in that speech that Soviet Russia doesn't desire war, it desires the fruits of war, and that all of the countries of Central and Eastern Europe were now under a high measure of control from Moscow. And effectively, everything he said was true, because this is what Stalin was doing. Stalin was gradually taking over the countries of Eastern Europe through rigged elections and imposing communist governments. Stalin responded to this speech. He called Churchill a warmonger. Within a year, these two old wartime allies had completely fallen out with each other. and as you should know, Stalin's method of taking over Central and Eastern Europe was very, very calculated, shall we say. Now, Soviet troops were already present in countries such as Poland and Czechoslovakia. Obviously, they had liberated those countries from Nazi occupation. The troops had remained stationed there. So effectively, these were already countries under a physical occupation. But what Stalin did in all of these countries, he would bring the left-wing parties together, the socialists and the communist parties. He would bring them together into effectively coalitions, and then he would weed out opposition political parties. He would then have certain leaders of the other parties sent to Moscow for trial on charges of subversion and nationalist deviation. They would establish, very quickly, they would arrest potential dissidents and opponents. And then elections were held, which of course were massively rigged, and therefore communist governments were installed. And that process really went on from 1945 up to the takeover, the communist takeover of Czechoslovakia in 1948. So that's the crucial thing to be able to explain in an exam question: Stalin's basic methodology. Okay, so bringing left-wing parties together, weeding out the opposition, and then holding massively rigged elections that would return, the communist parties to power. Okay, there's a bit of extra information there on the slide for those of you who want to look at that process a bit deeper. So, how did the United States respond to all of this? Well, of course, they responded by announcing the Truman Doctrine. So we've already seen that Truman's ideas, his perceptions of the Soviet Union were being increasingly influenced by people like George Kennan and Winston Churchill. And he made a very famous speech to Congress in March 1947, effectively committing the United States to a policy of containing communism, containing the spread of communism. He was giving a speech in Congress because obviously the first containment was first, the first area to be contained, as it were, was Greece, because there was a civil war taking place between the Greek monarchists and the communists. And so, of course, he needed congressional approval to mobilize American forces to assist in the Greek Civil War. And he said in his speech, effectively, that there's the choice between two worlds: the free world, which is, he said, distinguished by free elections and free institutions, and the communist world, which was, distinguished by oppression, a police state, rigged elections. And he said it must be the duty of the United States to assist any country that was facing subjugation from outside forces. So the Truman Doctrine was a commitment by the United States to contain communism within its existing borders. A big part of that, of course, wasn't just the American assistance in the Greek Civil War, it was the American financial assistance to Western Europe. And so several months later, in June of 1947, the Secretary of State, George Marshall, or General Marshall, announced the European Recovery Program, or better known as the Marshall Plan. And this was the loaning of a huge sum of money, $13 billion to start with, but it went up to $17 billion eventually, to help in the restructuring and the rebuilding of Western Europe. So Marshall, Truman, they recognized that, these countries ravaged by 6 years of war, they had to be rebuilt if peace was to flourish, if democracy was to flourish. They recognized that in conditions of want and misery, political extremism, like communism, flourishes in those type of circumstances. So Europe had to be reconstructed, and a huge amount of money had to be invested in Europe for that to happen, for democracy and freedom to take root. particularly in countries like France and Italy, where the communist parties were very, very well supported and had every chance of winning the general elections. So reconstruction through the loaning of American goods and money and resources was a fundamental part of the Truman Doctrine. Now, of course, there were criticisms, many on the Soviet side. As we know, they saw this as America adopting a policy of dollar imperialism, dominating Western Europe financially, being able to dictate how that money was spent, ensuring that the money had to be spent on American goods. So this was very much about maintaining America's economic recovery by ensuring that it didn't lose vital markets in Western Europe. In fairness, the Americans were quite honest about that. George Marshall said as much in his speech in which he announced the Marshall Plan. Now, one of the main issues, of course, in the rising tensions was the continuing disagreement over the future of Germany and Berlin. All they'd agreed to at Potsdam was the dismemberment of Germany, but what would be the long-term plan? So Stalin always foresaw that Germany would eventually be united, and it would be united as a communist state under a high degree of Soviet influence. As far as he was concerned, the Soviets had borne the brunt of the German invasion and the war, and it was only right that Germany should remain weak and not a threat to the Soviet Union, and it should remain a loyal communist government. But by 1947 and 1948, it was becoming clear that the United States disagreed with that. And it was becoming clear that Britain and America in particular, when they brought their zones of occupation combined them into Bizonia, it was quite clear that they were already beginning the process of building a separate West German state, which would imply, of course, that Germany was going to be permanently divided. So Stalin very quickly began to build up communist forces in the Soviet zone of occupation, using the same tactics that he'd used in Central and Eastern Europe. He brought the Communist Party and the Socialist Party together to form the Socialist Unity Party, which would become the single ruling party in communist East Germany. In 1948, as you should know, via the Marshall Plan, a new currency was introduced not just into the western zones of Germany, but also into the western zones of Berlin, which prompted Stalin to try to force the Western powers out of Berlin completely with the blockade. Excuse me. So, from the get-go, the western zones of occupation in Berlin were an embarrassment to the Soviets. The Soviets had liberated Berlin first, and now there were two currencies in circulation in Berlin. The Western currency was much more valuable. The East German Berliners would be able to compare, their communist currency unfavorably with this new, more powerful Western-backed currency. So this was the final straw to Stalin, and he blockaded Berlin with a view to trying to force the Western powers out of Berlin altogether. So on the 24th of June 1948, he cut off all road, rail and canal routes into Berlin. The Western powers responded, of course, with the airlift, and this went on for almost a whole year, and it was only called off on the 12th of May 1949, and it was at this point, of course, that the threat of a major war between the US and the Soviet Union became very real. We know that the United States, initially they believed they shouldn't recognize the blockade and just and smash through it, but then cooler heads prevailed. Operation Vittles and Plainfare was this joint British and American airlift operation where supplies were flown into West Berlin every single day for the best part of a year. We know that the Soviet fighter planes buzzed the civilian planes engaged in the airlift. As a result of that, the Americans began to station their B-29 bombers, which carried atomic bombs to various different air bases in Western Europe, including Britain. So the threat of nuclear war was quite real during this time. So ultimately, Stalin blinked first, and he called off the blockade. And the West, particularly the United States, had survived the first real major test. They were not going to be pushed out of Berlin. The consequences of the blockade are very important to understand. It eventually results, of course, in the creation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. So any Western European country attacked by the Soviet Union would now be collectively defended by all of the countries in Western Europe and NATO. So often historians call this the kind of the nuclear umbrella. It also sped up the division of Germany, the permanent division of Germany. So in May 1949, the British, French, and American zones were united into a new government called the Federal Republic of West Germany. And several months later, in October 1949, the Soviet zone of Germany was transformed into the GDR, the German Democratic Republic, which of course was a communist dictatorship. So there were some really important consequences in terms of the blockade. Okay, so we don't know how the origins of the Cold War is going to come up. It could come up as the source questions. It could come up as the 16 marker or the 8 marker. But just some, general reminder when we're evaluating sources, particularly the question 2, the question that asks you about how useful the sources are. All right, we need to think about content of the source. What is the source saying? What's the message of the source? Does it have a point to make? What's useful about the content? Is it credible? What's useful about the provenance? So look at who's producing the source, who's writing it, who is the source intended for, what were the circumstances under which the sources were produced. Okay, so if you measure the use of the source both in terms of its content and in terms of its provenance, and of course in terms of context, use your contextual knowledge. Is the source making claims which are credible? Does it have propagandist or biased elements to it? And even then, it can still be useful. Very often, sources, even if they're not honest, they're useful because it shows us how perhaps the Soviet Union wanted their citizens to perceive a particular event. Okay, so content, provenance, context. These are all the ways that we must measure the utility of sources. Question 1, of course, will be a very simple source question. So there's an example here. Source A is critical of the Soviet Union. How do you know? All you need to do to answer that question is to look at the provenance, look at the content of the source. It's only worth 4 marks. The real test, of course, is the question 2, which is the 12-mark utility question. That's the one where you've got to really make sure you have your critical thinking cap on. And again, just to go back, content, provenance, context. Those are all the ways which we measure how useful a source is. So please remember that formula. So this specimen answer was on the Easter revision resource, so I've replicated it here. Just a reminder how we approached question 3, write an account. Most of the time the question is targeting cause and consequence. Sometimes there's more of an emphasis on cause. Most of the time there's more of an emphasis on consequences. We're not telling a story. So in this case, how did the Berlin blockade increase tensions? So we need to build up an understanding of why the blockade happened. What were the tension points that existed prior to the blockade that resulted in Stalin blockading Berlin? And then perhaps the most important part of your answer, your second paragraph, consequences. How did the blockade increase tensions? Okay, so have a look at that response. That may well be the question 3 from this week's exam. It hasn't come up before as a write-an account, so we just don't know. So it's a good one to have a look at, I would suggest. Then the big, obviously, 16 marker. The origins of the Cold War could come up as a 16 marker. So this is a question that I've put together. The main reason for the development of the Cold War in the period 1945 to 1941 was disagreement over the future of Germany and Berlin. How far do you agree with this statement? We've had the origins of the Cold War come up before as a 16 marker, but of course then this is a different question in as much as that it's putting the stated factor is now the emphasis on Germany and Berlin. All right, so there's a plan there that I've got you started. If you want, you can have a go at completing this plan and coming up with a judgment paragraph. But I would suggest there's never been an emphasis before on Germany and Berlin as a factor for tensions up to 1949. So it is possible that if this comes up, if the origins of the Cold War come up as a question 4, the examiners may well target this particular factor. Okay, well that concludes part 1 of the revision lesson. So if you are doing this remotely, listening to the recording, do make sure that you've spent some time obviously looking at some of those questions and planning some of those questions. So this is a 26-minute recording, so make sure that you're spending the last half an hour of the first hour, as I say, having a look at some of those questions and planning them. Okay, I'll see you in part 2.